Good afternoon and welcome to Radio Irava on CHUO 89.1 FM in Ottawa, chuo.fm and radioirava.com worldwide. My name is Narges. Today is August 17, 2014. I guess you're wondering why I'm speaking to you in English at this time of the show. Usually Irava's English segment begins at 3:45, but not today. The reason for this change is the article I read this week called Iran's Secret Massacre, The Untold Legacy by Mr. Hamid Yazdan Panah, which looks at the massacre of 30,000 political prisoners who were executed in the summer of 1988, which occurred in the time frame of 3 weeks under the direct order of founder of Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini. Hamid Yazdan Panah, who is an immigration attorney and the director and the founder of Near East Observatory, focuses his practice primarily on immigration, hoping to serve as a resource to immigrants and refugees. Hamid has never seen Iran but was born into an Iranian family who had to flee the country after the 1979 revolution. As an Iranian refugee, Mr. Yazdan Panah understands the challenges faced by those immigrating to a new country. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of California, Davis and Juris Doctor from Mcgeorge School of Law. In his article, Iran's Secret Massacre, The Untold Legacy, he looks at 1988 Iran Massacre from a legal point of view and as a guide to go forward. Here's my conversation with Hamid Yazdan Panah. Thank you, Hamid Yazdan Panah, for agreeing to be on Radio Irava. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Hamid, we are going to talk about an era in Iran's history where the Iranian people were the witness to the most horrendous act being carried out in prisons by the Iranian regime. Of course, I'm talking about the massacre of thousands of political prisoners in the summer of 1988. Interestingly enough, Hamid, in your recent article called Iran's Secret Massacre, The Untold Legacy, you look at the 1988 massacre not as a stagnant era, but as a guide to go forward. Could you set up the time frame for us in 1988 and also tell us under whose leadership the massacre actually occurred?
Something that I tried to, expand on in the article that I wrote, because the treatment of political prisoners, the horrific conditions in the prisons, have all been documented by eyewitness accounts. And so it's not my job to try and tell people what happened. I think that, there's plenty of people who are out there today who could talk about that. But I tried to expand on the psychological impact that massacre had on the Iranian people and the impact that it still has today. And so in my article, I try and talk about the fact that, the 1980s began with a lot of hope for people in Iran. So you had the 1979 revolution, which removed the Shah. It united the country. People were very optimistic. People were hopeful about the future. A lot of different political parties, a lot of different ethnic groups all came together and said no to the Shah. So you had an era where it was a lot of hope, a lot of aspirations, but very quickly, unfortunately, the tide turned. And so there's a very stark contrast between what started as a great and hopeful era and what happened when Khomeini came in and was able to sort of pull the rug out from underneath the masses and steal that revolution, so to speak. And you had, in a span of just a few years, going from hopes of democracy, freedom, and equality to really very, very violent and closed society that unfortunately also coincided with the war with Iraq. And so you had a war that was going on and, thousands of people dying through the war. And then you also had massive political repression at home. You had Khomeini executing people in the streets sometimes, people as young as 15, 16 years old being arrested and executed, within 24, 48 hours, or people going missing and no one ever hearing about them again. And so all of this bloodshed that started to accumulate beginning in the early 1980s and leading up all the way to the 1988 massacre of political prisoners, which was the height of the bloodshed in that decade. And it really represented, in my opinion, the breaking of, the spirit of that revolution, where people completely lost all hope as to, somehow salvaging this revolution. And Khomeini really betrayed the masses when he did that. He went from a position of complete, almost holy stature among the people, where people thought he was a representative of God and he could do no wrong, to ordering the execution of the best, sons and daughters of Iran in a horrific massacre. And it was such a horrific massacre that to this day it's almost taboo to even talk about it or think about it or discuss it openly in Iran. And it really, really shook the confidence of Iranian people towards their leaders, and also it created a sort of a fear to even be involved in politics. And that's something that I talked about in the article, that to this day you see the legacy where people say in Iran, stay away from politics. Don't get involved in that. You're going to lose everything. And it's because of this betrayal that Khomeini, committed against the masses, the confidence they had in him, the trust they had in him and his leadership, and how he betrayed that trust led to people doubting everything, being cynical towards everything in Iran. And unfortunately, it leads to the regime surviving to this day. You see people who just don't trust anyone in politics in Iran, and as a result, they're apathetic. They remove themselves from politics, and it allows this regime that's one of the most barbaric in the world to continue to hold power in Iran. And I think that's precisely what they wanted in the short term in 1988, and it's what they wanted in the long term. And I think that's really the untold story of the massacre.
So let us go back a little bit, Hamid, and tell us, why do you think Khomeini ordered this killing? Who were these prisoners, first of all, who were arrested and they were executed in the 1988 especially? And why Khomeini did what he did? Weren't people supporting Khomeini in 1979?
This is obviously a lot of history, and it's hard for me to just summarize it briefly, but this is obviously the way I see it, and based on the research that I've done. I think that the conditions set for Khomeini's entry into the scene in Iran were really set by the Shah. And unfortunately, the Shah executed the leadership of a number of organizations, including the People's Mujahideen of Iran, which happened to be the organization that was the primary target of the 1988 massacre. But when the Shah executed the leadership of a number of progressive organizations, he also executed or killed other individuals like Ali Shariati, individuals who had the potential to lead the revolution in a progressive manner after the departure of the Shah. But unfortunately, these individuals were executed, and it created a vacuum among the progressive elements of the revolution, such that Khomeini and the clergy were the only social institution that was completely intact. And as a result, they had a very, very strong hold on the country, and they were able to organize, to take power, to seize power, both in terms of ideological power as well as physical and monetary power within Iran. And as a result, he was able to secure his position using theological rhetoric. He was able to dominate, political opinion to the extent that if you disagreed with him, then it was like disagreeing with God. And I think that the real issue, which plays into that same idea of disagreeing with God that led up to the massacre, was that you had elements which resisted him, and namely the People's Mujahideen of Iran, an organization that was in fact a Muslim organization. They were very clear about their opposition to Khomeini's brand of Islam, and they were very clear about the fact that they had a different interpretation of Islam, a different interpretation of the revolution, and what values they wanted to see the revolution lead to. And I think that they represented the biggest threat to Khomeini's brand of power, Khomeini's ideological brand of power, and what he was using to mobilize the masses. The PMOI, in many ways followed Ali Shariati's line, and he was one of the foremost thinkers of the revolution. Unfortunately, he didn't survive to see the revolution, but Khomeini rightly viewed them as the main opposition to his brand of Islam and his ideological interpretations. And as a result, in 1988, the war with Iraq was coming to a close, and I believe that he viewed the PMOI as a major threat in terms of the ideological weight that they carried. And he knew that the people who were committed to that ideology were influential people. That's really the bottom line. He viewed it as a threat for the hearts and minds of other Iranians who could be swayed by a more democratic, more tolerant version of Islam. And he knew that once the war was over, he didn't have the ability to use the war as an excuse to justify repression and to silence criticism. Because in a wartime environment, you can always say, you know, we're at war against a foreign enemy, and you need to support your government. You need to you know, this is not the time for criticism. This is not the time for this or that. But with the war winding down, I think that he knew that his government and the policies were unpopular to the extent that any opposition that came out and offered a different brand of Islam that was, you know, counter to his own was viewed as a major threat. Apart from that, there were a number of other organizations and individuals who were targeted in the massacre, mostly leftist, Marxist individuals, and who stood firm in their opposition to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they were also executed. And that's not to lessen the credibility or the stature that they had in terms of their political platforms, ideology, or you know, willingness to sacrifice for their beliefs. But for the most part, the primary victims of the massacre, and this is well documented by independent organizations and experts, it was the People's Mujahideen of Iran. They were the main targets of Khomeini's fatwa. It's all written there, and you know, in point of fact, it's clear just how much Khomeini was willing to risk in order to deal with this enemy and in order to try and stomp out this enemy. It got to the point where, you know, obviously he asked for this to be implemented, and one of it, you know, the most senior clerics in Iran, Ayatollah Montazeri, disagreed with his fatwa and disagreed with the way that things were going, and as a result, he was second in line to Khomeini, and as a result, he was blocked from, you know, succeeding Khomeini and ever coming to power. So you see, you know, the internal price that the regime paid to carry out this massacre, but you also see the reason why they felt like they had to do it, and it was because they wanted to terrorize a population that still had legitimate aspirations for a different interpretation of the revolution, a different interpretation for the future of Iran. And his only solution to that was to terrorize and to stomp out with, you know, bloody and you know, savage repression any sort of opposition, to the point that not only would he physically exterminate, you know, the people who were opposing him, but that he would traumatize the families of individuals, and even those who didn't have, you know, family members being executed, but anyone who even heard about what happened would be so shocked, so traumatized that they wouldn't dare even speak the names of these groups or you know, involve themselves with these groups.
Why did you write this article, Hamid?
One of the reasons why I wrote this piece, it was, you know, to commemorate, you know, the anniversary of this tragic event, but it was also because in my own personal work, I was doing an asylum application for an Iranian woman, a young Iranian woman, and in hearing her story and working on her story, she told me about the fact that she had an uncle who was executed in the 1980s, and she did not know that her uncle was executed until she was 12 or 13 years old, and someone in school told her about it. She didn't even know that she had an uncle that was executed, and she went home and she confirmed it with her parents, and her parents to this day, she said, and she's probably around 29, 30, something like, you know, she's older now, and to this day she's never heard the complete story. Her father, who was, you know, that was his brother, still doesn't talk to her about what happened. And
why
so,
is that, Hamid?
And it's because they're so traumatized, and you know, when you deal with death, whether it's a natural or unnatural death, you deal with it in stages, and there's from a psychological standpoint, there's different stages you go through in order to deal with death, in order to get over death. And something that I, you know, thought about or realized, and what I, you know, talk about in my article, is that the Iranian nation and individuals from, you know, a personal level with one individual to a family level to a societal level, they haven't come to terms with or haven't been able to cope with this massacre to the extent that they're able to get over it and move on and to really deal with it. And they're so traumatized by what happened, it's almost as if they're in denial. It's almost as if they think that one day they're going to wake up and that this is all going to be just a dream, that Khomeini didn't come to power, that the revolution can still somehow lead to what they want it to lead to. And I think that this sort of limbo that they're left in, where they can't come to terms with, they can't talk about it in their own families because they're so afraid of what happened, they're so afraid of anyone finding out or somehow losing their other loved ones, it's exactly what Khomeini wanted, and it's really led to the present predicament that we're in. The fact that you see so many young people in Iran that aren't, they don't want to be involved in politics or are afraid to be involved in politics, or the parents grew up telling them not to be involved in politics. It's for this very reason. And I mean, I've seen older families where the mother and father still think that somehow their child is going to come home, that they really to this day haven't accepted the fact that their child was executed, whether it was because they never saw the body, whether it was because they were never, told, what the last words of their child was, where he was buried. All of these things from a psychological standpoint have left sort of a void in their ability to cope with or accept the fact that this massacre, this tragedy happened, and it left them paralyzed. They didn't respond. They didn't respond in political terms. They didn't protest. They didn't mobilize. And you have mothers who lost their sons, or you have sons who lost their mothers, and you have people who are just broken in terms of not being able to get over what happened and not being able to mobilize politically to resist this regime. And the sad thing is that it's what these people died for is standing up and resisting this regime. And what I talk about in my article is moving forward and to really respect the people who paid the ultimate price for this. It would be to continue their path, to remember what they died for, to remember how they were able to stand up to this regime and to try and continue their path. And it's our responsibility to not forget them, but also not forget what they died for. And part of doing that is to deal with the harsh reality that we face ourselves in, the harsh reality that is going on in Iran, and to find a solution to that. And then that's what I hope that people can take from my article.
Hamid, I understand your point about the people inside Iran, but we have about a few million Iranians outside of the country, and they live in democratic societies with laws and orders. But there are skepticism about the Iranian resistance and the number of the people who were executed in the 1988, especially in 1988, which is said to be 30,000, because some people believe that it was only 5,000 or 6,000 people. It's been 26 years since that horrific act that happened and ordered by Khomeini, and those people were executed. My question is, what has prevented Iranians and Iranian resistance, for that matter, not to pursue this in United Nations or other international organizations?
The primary point, and I think that, this is all very clear when you look at any form of, genocide, massacre, or political or politicized killing, is that anytime that an event like that happens, there's a lot of issues in terms of the impartiality of an investigation. And to this present day, the Iranian regime remains in power. And so as a result, you can't have any sort of investigation. First of all, you can't have an investigation that's impartial if it requires the cooperation of the actual persecutor. You can't go to the Iranian regime and say, okay, well, let's see those records for the 1988 massacres. Why don't you share those with us? From a legal standpoint, it's ridiculous to try and assume that. Apart from that, I mean, what you're left with is eyewitness testimony. And eyewitness testimony can vary greatly, whether it's in a murder trial or whether it's in regards to a systematic execution of political prisoners in a country of, 30, 40, 50 million, or whatever the population of Iran was at that time. So I think that there's inherent flaws in, the eyewitness testimony of any single person to try and say that, this was the number of people executed, this was not the number of people executed. But I think that as far as the resistance goes, and, I'm not going to specify any one individual or one group as being the primary party that's responsible for this. I think that the international community as a whole should be held responsible for pursuing this issue, and the United Nations and a number of international organizations were made aware of what was going on in Iran at the time. They did not, in my opinion, pursue that information to the best of their abilities. And unfortunately, it's led to the situation that you have to this day. Whether or not we'll ever be able to prove exactly how many number of people were killed, it remains to be seen. It's very difficult. If you look at the Nazi Holocaust, to this day you have people who deny the number of individuals killed, and the estimates can vary widely. And that's a Holocaust that was very, very well documented with people having their serial numbers tattooed on their arms, and there being a complete list of, people in different concentration camps and so forth, and you still have huge debates about the number of individuals killed. My point, and the thing what I think personally, is that as people who are, actively supporting the Iranian resistance and also putting all the blame on the Iranian regime in regards to what happens, the onus and the responsibility is not on the Iranian resistance or Iranian people to try and act as impartial investigators to this massacre. If you're a victim of a crime, or if you're the victim of a tragedy, the responsibility is not on you to try and investigate that crime. You're the victim of that crime. The responsibility is normally placed on an independent party that's unbiased in regards to what actually occurred. That's the only way that you can actually gather evidence in a logical and coherent manner. It is the responsibility of Iranians, whether inside Iran or outside Iran, to advocate for this to take place. And that's something that I did in my article, is that I continuously advocate, and I think the Iranian resistance has advocated for this issue to be taken up by the United Nations Security Council as a basis for crime against humanity, and for there to be an independent tribunal or independent investigation set up. But the reality is that will never take place until the Iranian regime is overthrown. That's the absolute reality. There's no way that we're ever going to be able to access those records. And unfortunately, there may never be a complete or full investigation as to exactly what happened, what happened in each prison, what the total number of people were, because this was a massacre that was carried out outside the judicial norms of due process, outside the norms of justice or accountability, and people were buried in mass graves. People were buried without a formal sentence, or executed without a formal sentence or due process of law. So when you have a complete lack of accountability or oversight, or the fact is, I'm sure the regime didn't want to preserve information. They didn't want to create a documentary record as to what happened. So in terms of the number of individuals killed, as an Iranian, we're going to go off of the estimates that the resistance gives, because that's the party that was involved in the massacre. And it's not our, in my opinion, and some people may disagree with this, but in my opinion, it's not our responsibility to scrutinize the political positions of a resistance organization that is actively fighting a government that remains in power. If our responsibility and our viewpoint is that the regime needs to go for there to be an independent investigation, then our scrutiny should be towards the regime. My entire critique and my entire focus is on the culpability, the responsibility, and really the crimes against humanity committed by the Iranian regime. And I talk about this very explicitly in my piece, that anything short of that is something that benefits the regime. The regime's entire sort of response to this massacre was to try and they continue this to this day, is to try and shift the blame onto the victim. It's to try and take all the anger, frustration, the suspicion, the mistrust that's placed against the regime, and they reshape those feelings, and they redirect it towards the opposition and say, well, if the PMOI hadn't engaged in armed struggle, well, maybe we wouldn't have executed them. Or if the PMOI, didn't do this, or if the PMOI didn't do that, well, maybe, people wouldn't have been executed the way they're executed. And so you have people in Iran who are living under the regime, who are afraid to walk outside of their doors because of the regime, and yet they somehow have been indoctrinated with this idea that, it's the Iranian regime. And I bring up other examples in my piece where, to this day, in the 2009 protests, which were supported by everyone in the world, right. And there were just explicit scenes of the Iranian people rising up for freedom, and you had the regime on the other end firing into the crowd, beating people with clubs, imprisoning people. You had these horrific scenes, and yet the regime used the same exact lines, and you even had these lines being repeated, unfortunately, by other Iranians, saying that, it was the PMOI who was causing this trouble. If anyone was killed today, it was actually... First, they would say, the PMOI shot that person. That protester was shot by the PMOI.
I remember they said that about Neda Agha Sultan.
Yeah, and it's the same line. It's the same line that they continue to use, and the same goes for individuals, whether they do it knowingly or unknowingly, or if they have an agenda or they don't have an agenda, if the only thing that you have to say about this massacre is not, why was this allowed to happen? How did this occur without the world community knowing? How did this occur without the regime being brought up on charges of crimes against humanity? Your only criticism is where did the PMOI or where did the Iranian resistance get this number? I think that at the end of the day, that's a disservice to the people of Iran. I think it's a disservice to the people who died in this massacre. And I think that in the end of the day, whether the people realize it or not, they're benefiting the regime. You can do that as a historian 50 years from now. 100 years from now, you can sit and debate the numbers without any political culpability or any kind of political ramifications because the regime is no longer in power. But while the regime is still in power, if you do that, then you're lessening the crime and the burden on the regime. You're putting the burden on the party that was the victim. It's as if you go into a court of law and you shift the entire burden onto the person that was a victim of a crime and say, well, you need to prove this, and that's really not fair from a legal standpoint.
On the other hand, Hamid, we see and we hear entities or individuals trying to deny the MEK, even their supporters' presence in prisons in the 1980s when they have special gatherings or when they are having meetings to talk about what happened in 1988. Why do you think that is? Why people don't want to recognize that most of the individuals were executed in 1988 were actually from Mujahideen?
I think it's a combination of the two things that I talk about in my article. One is the deep skepticism and cynicism with which Iranians now view politics, and it's gotten to the extent that they want to try and deal with politics in sort of an abstract or as if it's just like an academic exercise where there's no war going on actively. Let's just talk about this massacre from a historical perspective, and we can read a little bit of poetry and we can sort of cry about it or whatever, but they don't talk about, number one, what this massacre did in the 1980s, what the political context was, who the victim was, and number two, how this regime still remains in power today. And this is a problem that I have with Iranians right now. It's, you can talk about how great Iran is as a country and how beautiful it is, but when there's people being executed in the streets, all of that should be put aside. And we can't talk about Iranian national pride or the fact that an Iranian woman won the Nobel Prize or whatever, the Fields Medal for mathematics, without talking about the fact that our country leads the world in executions per capita, or is one of the only countries in the world that continues to execute minors. I mean, these are barbaric, horrific things that people see when they walk down the street in Iran. You see someone hanging from a crane, and I think that these are things that Iranians, because they're so cynical or they become so cynical about politics, they try and ignore that. Well, we can't do anything about it, so let's pretend like it's not there. That's one side of it. The other side of it is this idea of blaming the victim, that it was the PMOI's fault, that the PMOI's ideology or their supporters brought this upon themselves, so it's better to just not even talk about them because they're somehow outside of the norm, and it's okay to execute people who are outside of the norm, and so we better not even talk about the fact that they are PMOI because that'll just legitimize the massacre. So I mean that's what the regime has successfully been able to accomplish, is to make everyone apathetic about politics to the extent that they don't want to be involved in it, and the only person that benefits is the person who's in power. If people are apathetic towards the government, then it benefits the government. That's what the Iranian regime knows very well. The second thing is to demonize and undermine any sort of opposition group to the point that if you oppose the regime and you're vocal about your opposition, then you're a terrorist. And what do you do with terrorists? Well, you execute them, and it's justified and legitimized. And that's what they've been able to accomplish. The young girl that I spoke to. She even to this day, even here in the United States, when she talks about these issues, she talks about it with fear. She talks about it with fear as if someone knew that she was talking about it, she could get in trouble somehow. And, she talked about other individuals in her family who had been supporters of the PMOI, and she said it with shame to me. and she didn't even really know why she said it was shame. She admitted it herself. She didn't know anything about the group. She just knew that it was somehow stigmatized, that it was somehow bad to talk about it, that it was somehow bad to be connected with it. And I think that's what the regime wants to have happen. It wants to have people be so afraid that they feel like they're under constant surveillance and under constant threats to even think wrong thoughts about what's going on in Iran or about these organizations.
Why do you think there's so much focus on the 1980s killing by the Iranian regime and that era, especially in 1988? Isn't that still happening in Iran? You just mentioned some of the atrocities that are going on in Iran right now on the streets of Iran. Why do you think it's important to focus on that era especially?
Well, I think that, and that's something that I try to talk about in my article, I think that it's important for people to recognize what happened, because I believe that when it happened in 1988, no one was able to react properly to how it happened, because everyone was so shocked by what happened. I think everyone was shocked by what happened, whether it was people abroad or people living in Iran, or even people within the government's ranks. I think that even people in the Iranian regime were shocked at the extent and the horror that this massacre inflicted on the regime, and it's something that, in my opinion, is unresolved in the Iranian nation's psyche. It's something that is still there, that needs to be dealt with. It's something that to this day that they carry with them. I think that whether you're someone that was an adult at that time, or a young adult, or if you were a child at that time, that era stays with you. I think that myself included, a lot of the children that were born in the 80s, they were born out of a difficult circumstance, whether they were dealing with the war or whether they were dealing with repression. People grew up with or were born with their mother or father in jail, or they were born as refugees in other countries. And when you're born in a circumstance like that, you obviously don't realize the impact that it has on you immediately. But down the line, you have to come to terms with these issues, and I think that you have to try and overcome these issues. I think whether it's a mother and father accepting the death of their son and realizing why he died, and what he died for, or if it's a wife who lost her husband, or if it's a son who lost his father. I think that in order for people to move on and to move forward as a nation, and that means moving forward in terms of becoming a better nation, becoming a free nation, a democratic nation, a modern nation. We have to overcome these psychological barriers that Iranian people have. And in my opinion, the primary ones are this cynicism towards politics, this idea that we're not responsible for politics, that I'm living my life here in America and whatever happens in Iran happens in Iran, and I can't speak for Iranians. I think that's wrong. I think that we all have a responsibility. I think people who live abroad have a higher responsibility to uncover what happened in 1988. And I think that people in Iran too have a responsibility to come to terms with what's going on and to hold the people that should be held accountable for this massacre and hold them responsible. We're not going to forget. If it takes 20 more years, we're not going to forget who these people were and what their role was, whether it's Mousavi or Khamenei or Rafsanjani or any number of individuals. They need to be held accountable both for what happened and also to set a precedent for Iran and for the Middle East, that we're moving on from this era of people executing other people with impunity and getting away with these horrific massacres. And we're going to say no to this, and we're going to move on. We're going to do something differently. And I think that that's why a lot of people, whether they're actually political prisoners themselves or young Iranians like myself, are making a conscious effort to remember what happened, because it was such a horrific massacre. And I think that that's something that should also be noted as well, was that I don't think that in any time in Iran's history has there been a massacre that was carried out in such a systematic way against a specific group of people and carried out with such brutality, where you just had summary executions that took place. It was, like a Nazi concentration camp, where it was just a systematic killing of a large number of people based on a specific characteristic they shared, and that was usually their political opinion. And I think that's something that's not easily resolved in the psyche of a nation. I think it's not easily resolved in the memories of individuals, whether they were actively involved or not. I think that people are still traumatized by it, and trauma runs deep. It's something that takes a long time to get over, and it oftentimes takes a really great toll on the individual before they're able to overcome it. And I think it's taken a great toll on the Iranian nation. I think that it's taken a toll to this very day, and I think that it's one of the primary reasons why this regime is still in power and still dominates, Iran the way it does.
And you mentioned that acceptance is the first step.
Yes, exactly. My piece, obviously, I have my own views on it, but my piece was really meant to provoke thought about this issue, to have people reflect on, where was I in the 1980s? What did I think about it? What was my reaction? And did I really actually think about what was going on? And have I accepted what happened? Or am I still somehow in denial about the horror that this regime inflicted on the nation? And am I in denial about my own responsibility in responding to what happened?
Hamid Yazdan Panah, thank you very much for your insight. I appreciate your time and hope that one day soon justice is served for the victims of the summer of 1988 massacre and their families.
As do I. Thanks for having me.